What is GDP and how does it affect the US economy? There's one number that economists, investors, and politicians all watch closely: GDP. Today's video is about GDP, what it is, how it affects the US economy, and why you always hear about it on the news. GDP is often called the heart of the economy. When GDP is growing, the economy is usually healthy. When GDP slows or shrinks, people start to worry, and that's why GDP makes headlines so often. So first things first. What does GDP actually stand for? GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. Gross means the total amount. Domestic means produced within a country. And product refers to all the goods and services that are made. Subscribe for more videos like this. Put together, gross domestic product means the total value of all goods and services produced in a country during a specific time period, usually every quarter or every year, and it is expressed in dollars. The supermarket analogy. Think of GDP like a giant supermarket. This supermarket sells products like clothes, food, and electronics. And it also sells services like key cutting, photo printing, and beauty services. Every time someone buys a good or a service in that supermarket, the price they pay is added together. At the end of the day, the sum of all those prices is the supermarket's GDP. A country is just like that supermarket, except instead of one store, it's millions of businesses. Every final product and service produced across the country adds up to GDP. There's an important rule to remember. GDP counts the prices of final goods and services based on the country where they are produced. For example, if a dress is made in China and sold in a store in the United States, it does not count toward US gross domestic product. That's because it wasn't produced in the US. But it does count toward China's GDP as it was produced in China. For the United States, that dress is an import, something the US buys from another country. Imports are subtracted from GDP. Now flip the situation. If a gadget is made in the United States and sold in a store in China, it does count toward US GDP. That's because the production happened in the US. For the United States, that sale is an export, something the US sells to another country. Exports are added to GDP. So the rule is simple. To count toward US GDP, a good or service must be produced in the US. What GDP can tell us. GDP measures how much an economy produces in total. It does not measure how good life actually is. It leaves out important things like volunteer work, caring for family members, and how happy people feel about their lives. For example, cooking at home does not count toward GDP. Ordering the same meal from a restaurant does. GDP can go up when more goods are produced, even if that causes problems. If factories produce more goods, GDP goes up, even if that production causes pollution or harms people's health. Sometimes, bad events can raise GDP. After a natural disaster, money is spent on repairs and rebuilding. That spending increases GDP. The same happens with security and healthcare. More spending raises GDP. But GDP does not subtract what was lost. It does not measure crime, illness, or suffering. Only the spending that happens around them. So GDP tells us how busy the economy is, not how well people are actually living. If this is helping you understand the economy better, hit subscribe for more clear explanations. Who created GDP? GDP was created in the 1930s by an economist named Simon Kuznets, while he was working for the US government during the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a period of severe global economic collapse. At the time, the government needed a clear way to measure how badly the economy had fallen and whether it was recovering or getting worse. GDP was designed to track economic activity, not people's happiness or quality of life. But here's the important part. Kuznets himself warned that GDP should not be used to measure overall well-being or living standards. So GDP measures economic output, not quality of life, and problems arise when people treat it as the full picture of how well a country is doing. GDP per capita and why it's misleading. You might also hear the term GDP per capita. It means a country's total GDP divided by its population. And a high GDP per capita doesn't mean everyone is doing well. The rich can be getting richer while others struggle. For example, in the United States, GDP per capita is around $90,000 per person, which sounds very high. But that does not mean the average American earns or lives like they make $90,000 a year. For example, if a small number of people and companies produce a very large share of a country's output, the average looks high, even if most people are not well off. So even though the US has a high GDP per capita, it hides inequality and doesn't show how evenly wealth is shared. Comparing countries. When we compare countries by GDP, we're measuring the total size of the economy. Think of GDP like a big pie. The United States has the largest GDP in the world at around $27 trillion, the biggest pie. China's GDP is also huge at around $18 trillion, much larger than countries like Germany or the UK. But GDP per capita asks a different question. How many people in a country are sharing that GDP pie? China has over 1.4 billion people, and its GDP per capita is around $13,000. The UK and Germany have far fewer people. The UK's GDP per capita is around $50,000 and Germany's is around $55,000. So even though China's GDP is very large, it's divided among many more people. That's why China's GDP per capita is much lower than the UK and Germany. Now look at Luxembourg. Luxembourg's total GDP is small, at around $100 billion, so the pie is small. But its population is tiny. When you divide Luxembourg's GDP by its small population, GDP per capita becomes very high, over $120,000 per person. Each person's slice is much larger. That's why Luxembourg has the highest GDP per capita in the world, even though its total GDP is far smaller than the United States. When GDP per capita is higher, countries usually have higher wages and better infrastructure. They also tend to have better healthcare, stronger education systems, and more public services. This isn't perfect, and it isn't evenly shared, but on average. It's true. How is GDP actually calculated? Economists calculate GDP using a simple equation. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Let's break that down with easy examples. C stands for consumer spending. This is the total money spent by people in a country. Examples include buying groceries, paying rent, purchasing clothes, or getting haircuts. I stands for business investment. This is the money businesses in a country spend to grow or improve. Examples include factories buying new machines, companies building new offices, or businesses purchasing computers and software. G stands for government spending. This is the total money the government spends on goods and services. Examples include paying teachers and police, building roads and bridges, and funding public health care. X minus M stands for net exports, which is total exports minus total imports. Exports are things the U.S. sells to other countries, like airplanes or agricultural products. Imports are things the U.S. buys from other countries, like electronics or cars. If exports are greater than imports, GDP increases. If imports are greater than exports, GDP decreases. Together, these four parts make up a country's total GDP. GDP, recessions and depressions. GDP measures how much an economy is producing over time, and it naturally goes up and down. Think of GDP like the weather. When GDP is growing, it's like good weather. Businesses are active, people are spending, and jobs are easier to find. When GDP starts to fall, it's like a cold spell. Things slow down, businesses become cautious, and unemployment can rise. In the United States, a recession is not officially defined by 2 quarters of falling GDP. Instead, a recession is a broad slowdown across the economy. Production falls, jobs are lost, income drops, spending slows, and it lasts more than a few months. A recession is like a bad season, such as a long winter, uncomfortable and harmful, but it usually passes. If economic activity stays very low or keeps falling for a long time and the damage lasts for years, that's a depression. A depression is like a multi-year drought. It affects nearly everything. It causes widespread damage. Recovery takes a very long time. The Great Depression of the 1930s is a clear example. Why GDP is still used. So, if GDP doesn't tell the whole story, why does everyone still care about it? Because GDP is a quick snapshot of the economy. It shows whether economic activity is speeding up or slowing down. GDP doesn't tell us how people feel or how evenly money is shared. But it does tell us whether the economic engine is running fast or slowing down. GDP shows the size and speed of the economy, not what life feels like inside it.